Good afternoon, humans. It's Paul here, out in my world of things. Yep, World of Stuff is on location this afternoon. I've gone out for a Sunday afternoon constitutional. It's early afternoon now, it's about 4ish. Just been for a little drive, grab myself a coffee, get a bit of fresh air, a little bit of a walk, before I settle down to tell you all about Justice League, the Snyder Cut. We've all seen it, we've all formed our opinions on it. I'm going to get back into the car in a moment. I'm going to sit and chat all things Snyder. Hello again. Well, I'm back. I'm back in the Stuffmobile, and yeah, the Snyder Cut. Okay, well, I've sat and watched the Snyder Cut, as I mentioned in the video I posted late last week. I wasn't going to sit and watch 4 hours of it because 4 hours is too long for anything. So I split it into, well, I was expecting to watch it in hour chunks, but I watched the first hour and a quarter, then I watched an hour, and then last night I belted through to the end. I got through the whole thing. Just to give a bit of history about the whole thing, of course, without repeating what's been said time and time again on various YouTube channels, various magazines in the press and online and so on. The Snyder Cut came about because of the poor reception to Joss Whedon's version of Justice League, which I think came out in 2017-18. Joss Whedon, as we recall, took over the filming, the directing of the film, after Zack Snyder suffered a family tragedy, and understandably he wanted to step back and spend time with his family to try and heal the wounds. But the resulting Justice League film wasn't a happy experience for anybody. We're now hearing all the stories from Ray Fisher, amongst other cast members, about Joss Whedon's alleged behaviour. It is all still alleged at this point. But clearly it wasn't a happy set that he stepped into. It was probably a difficult thing for him because he was taking over somebody else's vision for a film. That's always hard work. If you recall Bohemian Rhapsody, the Freddie Mercury and Queen biopic that came out a few years ago that Dexter Fletcher stepped into at the last minute, and he just had to pick up and run with the work that had been done by the previous director. It was Bryan Singer, if I recall. So he made a good fist of that, of salvaging something, but it wasn't the vision that he would have done for that film, no doubt. And we ultimately saw what Dexter was able to do with the biopic when he did The Brilliant Rocket Man, the Elton John film, which is richly imaginative because it was his vision for the film and how he wanted it to be. Do excuse me. So anyway, the Snyder Cut. Since Justice League came out and received such an appalling response from the public and the critics, of course, and didn't do brilliantly at the box office, there's been this growing groundswell of support to allow him to go back to the source material and put together the version of the film that he wanted to make. Now, a lot of people poo-pooed the idea and thought, there is no Snyder Cut. Joss Whedon filmed new material, he used footage, but there's nothing else. But as time wore on, the Snyder Cut campaign grew and grew, and it became obvious that there was actually more material available and that there could be a new version of the film. And eventually, I think it was HBO bankrolled reshoots and a re-edit to the cost of, I think it was $70 million to allow Zack Snyder to make his version of the film. First thing to say is kudos to the fans for campaigning to get what they wanted, and they've got what they wanted. Whether this sets a precedent, a worrying precedent for the future, I don't know. You may remember the furore a few years ago, and I think it was Star Wars The Last Jedi came out and the fans weren't happy, and there was this ridiculous campaign to get the film reshot to their preferred vision of what happened in the story, and unfortunately that never happened. My only concern about fans having too much say in the creative process is that it can send the original creative vision off balance and send the studios into a panic. Obviously, the studios want to satisfy the fans. They want to satisfy the larger audience as well. But I think if you pander to fans too much, you possibly get a narrow appeal product. I mean, a slightly different example to this is Doctor Who back in the 1980s when the show was running out of steam with the general public, and the producer at the time turned to the fans to find out what they wanted, which resulted in several years worth of stories that were rich in the show's continuity but baffled the general public, who were drifted away anyway. So I think you've got it's a fine line to tread between making something for the hardcore fans who want the detail and the general public who want to be entertained. So whilst I applaud the fans to an extent for getting this thing out there, I hope it doesn't happen again and again now with all these films that, you know, the way social media is, the way social media responds to criticism. It's sort of backpedaling and backtracking and apologies. And I hope the studios don't now react to poor reviews and poor public response to send the films back into the editing suite, in the editing room, get new bits filmed. I just don't want a film to arrive and then if you don't like it, think, well, never mind, they'll do another version next year, which I might like more. That's my only caveat to the whole existence of this thing. So again, I hope that the Snyder Cut fans are happy with what they've got, because this is it. This is the version. And it does look as if most of them have. I've looked at some of the online reviews. The fans seem generally happy to the point of euphoria. I think they're possibly overcompensating a bit for the very poor Whedon version. This has been received orgasmically and rapturously, and I don't know whether that's completely justified. My view of point of it, having seen the whole thing now, it is certainly a better film. It's a more cohesive film. It's a more coherent film. A lot of the material that was excised has been put back in sympathetically and sensibly. It's the same story. It's the story of Darkseid sending his minion Steppenwolf to the Earth to collect these 3 mother boxes, which once connected will give him extreme power and dominion over the universe. You can't help thinking of the Infinity Stones and Thanos' quest for ultimate power. It's that sort of MacGuffin that these big films go in for. And I'm not criticising it for that, but you do think, yeah, well, we've had all this, and this is a slight cliche, but it's the world of comic books. It's the sort of thing we're going to get. So I didn't necessarily object to that. But I think what Zack Snyder's done with this, he's straightened up a crumpled film, if you like, where the original had lots of sort of what and who's this and why and what. He's stretched it out now, and oh boy, he stretched it out. But all the plot points do make sense, and we understand what these things are. We understand a bit more about the characters. In the original, Joss Whedon version, we had the Flash introduced, and we had Aquaman introduced, and we had Cyborg introduced. And inevitably, in the 2-hour running time that the studio had demanded, they didn't get a lot of screen time. They didn't get much material to make them work. My criticism of DC movies has always been, particularly with Justice League, that they'd established, they'd done Batman and they'd done Superman and they'd done Wonder Woman, but they wanted the Avengers. That's what they really wanted. They wanted this big team, but they weren't prepared to put the legwork in to do a Flash origin and a Cyborg origin and an Aquaman origin at that point. They wanted to go straight to the Justice League, which meant you had to have these sequences introducing these characters. And in the Whedon Cut, they were all very rushed. You didn't really feel you got to know these characters. You didn't really get any sense that they would bond as a team. Snyder's Cut does improve on that to an extent. Certainly for Cyborg, played by Ray Fisher, you get a lot of his backstory, which makes you understand his character a bit more. I mean, it's not hugely original. He's a high school jock who's a bit distant from his father. He's in a car accident. His mother dies. He's critically injured, but his father helps him recover by effectively cybernizing him, cyberneters, turning into a half man, half machine, or basically 85% machine. He's basically DC's Iron Man. He's a metal man with a bit of human face. He's got his humanity, but he's a machine. And of course, he's bitter towards his father because he feels that if his father had been more involved, this wouldn't have happened. His mother wouldn't have died. That's a bit clearer now than it was in the original. Flash, I don't think he's particularly well established. You get a couple of opening scenes sort of introducing him, Barry Allen, and his slightly sort of klutziness. And you get extended scenes about Arthur Curry as Aquaman. So a lot of that is stuff we're familiar with, but it does feel less rushed in this particular version. You do get a lot more time to get used to these characters and get to know them and sort of accept Batman's quest to pull them together as a team to fight this ancient evil that's coming. Otherwise, you've got Batman, who's Ben Affleck, who I think gives a perfectly serviceable performance as a sort of low-rent Christian Bale, complete with the growly Batman voice. Batman always does feel out of place in this sort of story, because we're used to Batman as, the dark detective. Seeing him involved in this heavy science fiction story seems a bit odd, because he's generally this dark knight who prowls the city, beating up bad guys. Take him into a science fiction setting and it just doesn't suit him particularly, especially when he hasn't got any powers. He's just a great acrobat and a detective. There's a scene, there will be a couple of spoilers here. There's a scene later on where he's battling Superman, and Superman is blasting him with his heat vision, and he sort of fends him off with his gloves, which are obviously much stronger than just ordinary gloves. Wonder Woman is great. I do like Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. She's not the best actress in the world, but she suits that part so well. And I do love that musical sting that they use for her when she's springing into action. I mean, that's really, it is real sort of, shivers up the spine stuff, because it sort of suits the image of that character. Her introduction is still that peculiar bank robbery sequence in London in the first episode in the first sequence, in the early sequence, with her for some reason standing at the top of the Old Bailey looking down over London, just as these terrorists are threatening to blow up part of London. It's still a good scene. It's still well done. It's a little bit more violent than it was in the Whedon cut, but it's quite well put together and it's quite exciting. Also, the battle on Themyscira, when Darkseid and his minions attack Minerva and the Amazonians, is very well done. Issues I have about a lot of that stuff is the slow motion that Zack Snyder insists in doing everything in slow motion. So you get these really energetic action sequences, particularly in the first half of the film, but everything suddenly slows down for these portentous, godlike images of these characters hurtling through the sky. And suddenly it just everything stops. Everything just comes down to a standstill, because he's doing these dramatic slow-mo scenes that I don't think are particularly dramatic. I think the worst example of that is when the Flash gets involved with saving a woman from a car crash, and I assume that's the character who'll go on to become Iris Allen, as she is, I think, in the TV series and in the comic books. But she's done in this extreme slow motion where she's hit by this truck where the driver's lost control, and everything just becomes completely slow motion, and there's no sense of speed or energy to it. It's just this electrified scene of him sort of moving along, smirking as he saves this girl. It just has no energy to it. And that does happen in some of the other later battle scenes, and of course in the sequence where Superman is resurrected later on. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff I liked in it. The problem I have with the whole thing is it is so joyless. There are a few sort of attempts at humour, but it's not sort of naturalistic humour. You get a couple of one-liners from The Flash and Aquaman and things, but it's so set against the tone of the rest of the thing that it sort of stands out. But it is joyless is the only word, really. It's a sort of it's not one of those punch the air films. I find this with and I'm trying not to use the M word too much, because I know it winds people up, because they're different types of film. But Marvel's films are so full of joy and life and colour and fun. Even when the stakes are high, you still had jokes and things like Endgame and Infinity War, witty comments. But the DC stuff, particularly the Snyder stuff, is just so relentlessly portentous and pompous. And all the slow motion stuff and these over dramatic scenes of people, it's not fun. There's no element of fun to the adventure. You're sort of dragged along with it because you're watching it, but it's hard to love. Visually, it's okay. There's some few dodgy visual effects because it's so ambitious in terms of the CGI, especially in some of the big fight scenes. The fight scene with Superman, that's very similar to one in the Whedon cut, and the big battle at the end with Darkseid and his minions. There's so much CGI. There's so many people flying around, being knocked about and flashing coloured lights, that some of it can't help but look a bit under budgeted. And occasionally there are in fact quite a lot of scenes where there's so much green screen used in the backgrounds that the characters just don't look as if they're really there. Particularly I noticed in the scene where Diana Prince goes to the temple where an arrow has been fired from Themyscira, to try and summon her. She goes to this temple and none of it looks as if it's real. The backgrounds don't look real. It doesn't look as if she's in a real environment. And I got a lot of that from some of the location stuff that just looks as if And they probably were, to be fair. They were standing on a soundstage with green screen programmed in afterwards, but it just looks very much like it. In the best examples of this sort of thing, you don't get that sense. You do feel you can suspend the disbelief, that imagine that they're on an alien planet or some desert or wherever they're supposed to be. But in this, it did strike me that a lot of these backgrounds didn't convince me. So that's the Snyder Cut. A bit of a scattergun sort of look at it. I sort of enjoyed it. Once I got beyond that first plodding hour of pulling it all together, of stuff that I remembered from the Whedon Cut and the new stuff, it started to pick up the pace and it became watchable. I didn't love it. I don't know if I'd watch it again, because it is a slog. I mean, it's finding four. I mean, I didn't, I was never going to watch it in 4 hours, because it's just not the way I roll. So I watched it in bits, but there's nothing really in it that I want to rush back and watch again. If I think of the Marvel films, I could go home now and watch the runway fight from Civil War again, because it's so exciting to look at, and the battle with this Chitauri in Avengers Assemble, and lots of things. But there's nothing in this that grabbed me visually that I really felt, I've got to watch that bit again. So I did feel a sense of relief when it ended. And speaking of the ending, I do wish that Zack had ended it with that really good hero shot. And there's a couple of good hero shots where he's trying to do that Avengers thing of all the characters in frame, of course in slow motion, looming towards the camera. I like the shot at the end when all the characters are sort of lined up and the camera pans across and you see them all. The Flash has got this smile on his face. And I thought that was quite a nice little scene. I would have loved it to end there. But unfortunately, we had to have this following sequences, which were a drag. And at that point, I think we were at 3 hours, 35 minutes or so. I thought there's another half an hour. And it's just unnecessary. Now, I know there's a cameo appearance by the Martian Manhunter at the end, which fans will have wet themselves over, leading to a sequel. But the problem is, we know that there's not going to be a sequel. This film hasn't worked on its theatrical release, and this release just exists to satisfy the calls of the fans. There's been some whispers and talks this week that HBO might fund sequels. There's talk of 2 and 3. I don't see that happening under this regime. I don't think Zack Snyder will be coming back to these characters to carry on his story. But having said that, I would like to see another Justice League film, because I do like these characters. I did read these characters in the 60s and 70s, and I want to see them done justice on the screen. I don't think they have been. They've been underserved by a director whose vision doesn't suit me, and I don't think it doesn't suit a 4-hour running time. I think you could make a leaner, better Justice League film, but I think what he's done here is just restored his vision for this film. Now, whether his vision was always a 4-hour film, I just don't know. I don't know how this would have played if it had been in the cinemas. I don't think the studio would have allowed it to be this long. But that's a whole other issue. So in the end, he salvaged it and made something that's agreeable. I can say, I think the original Justice League I'd have given a 3 or 4 out of 10. I think this gets a 6 verging towards a 7. Because there was enough stuff towards the end to keep me watching, and I think that you can always watch Superman and Batman, even though Superman isn't really himself for most of the film. So I have sort of mixed feelings about it. My main thought is the people who wanted it have got it, and I hope that they liked it. But I'm hoping it doesn't set a precedent that this keeps happening now, that films that aren't well received go back to the drawing board to have extra bits added, because that just creates the whole sort of defeats the whole creative process. But it's not a disaster. If you're interested, you will watch it, or you will have watched it. If you, like me, I was sort of dismissing it out of hand, but I'm glad I've seen it. I'm glad I've seen what he was able to do with it and create his film, because he went through a tough time to get it there, and I think it's fair that it's seen. But I don't want to see another one like this. So that's the Justice League, the Snyder Cut. It's available now on Sky Cinema, incidentally. I think when I did my previous video, I wasn't sure where it was going to crop up, but it's on Sky Cinema. You can watch it there. I believe it's out on Blu-ray in May, so if you want a physical copy of it, it will be available. Have a look. Let me know what you thought of it, because you almost certainly would have seen it. Put your comments down below. Don't shout and scream if you disagree with me. It's just my opinion. A review is just a review. So let me know what you thought of it, and if you like this video from its unusual location today, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you very soon for some more stuff like content. Bye.